At the family dinner, my son-in-law announced, "Now that your wife is dead, go live in a nursing home." My daughter agreed, "You're just a worthless old man anyway." I stayed silent and kept eating. Then my grandson gasped at his phone. "Grandpa Blaine is on the Forbes Billionaire List. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. I'm 61 years old and I thought I knew what heartbreak felt like. I buried my wife Margaret 3 weeks ago. I thought that was the worst pain I'd ever endure. I was wrong. The dining room felt smaller than usual that Thursday evening. Sarah had insisted on this family dinner, said we needed to discuss my future now that Margaret was gone. I should have known better. I should have seen the trap in her overly sweet voice when she called, the way she kept saying Dad, like she actually cared. The mahogany table Margaret and I bought 40 years ago was set for 5. Sarah sat across from me, picking at her salmon with that disgusted expression she'd perfected in high school. My son-in-law Derek lounged in his chair like he owned the place, cutting his steak with theatrical precision. My grandson Tommy, barely 16, stared at his phone as usual, his dark hair falling over his eyes. "So, Dad," Sarah began, setting down her fork with deliberate care, "Derek and I have been talking." The way she said it made my stomach clench. Margaret always warned me about that tone. Sarah's plotting voice, she used to call it with a sad smile. Derek cleared his throat, straightening his tie. He always wore a tie to family dinners, like he was conducting business, which, I suppose, he was. "Blaine, we need to be practical about your situation." My situation. That's what they called being a widower now. "The house is too big for you," Sarah continued, not meeting my eyes. "And frankly, you can't take care of yourself. Look at you." I looked down at my flannel shirt, clean but wrinkled. My hands, spotted with age but still steady. I'd been taking care of myself just fine for 3 weeks, thank you very much. But I said nothing. Margaret always said silence was better than fighting with Sarah. Derek leaned forward, his voice taking on that patronizing tone he used with his clients. "Now that your wife is dead, it's time to face reality. You need to move to a senior living facility." The words hit me like a physical blow. Your wife, not Margaret, not Mom. Your wife, like she was some disposable thing. "There's a nice place about an hour from here," Sarah added, her voice brightening like she was discussing vacation plans. "Sunset Manor. They have bingo nights." Bingo nights. 43 years of marriage reduced to bingo nights. "I'm not ready for that," I managed to say, my voice smaller than I intended. Derek laughed. Actually laughed. "Ready? Blaine, you're barely keeping it together. When's the last time you showered? Really showered?" I had showered that morning, but I didn't defend myself. What was the point? Sarah reached across the table and patted my hand with fake sympathy. "Dad, you have to understand. You're old now. You don't have any value anymore. You can't contribute anything meaningful to this family." The room went dead silent. Even Tommy looked up from his phone, his young face shocked by his mother's cruelty. "You don't have any value anymore." The words echoed in my head, bouncing around like bullets in a metal box. I stared at my daughter, this woman I'd raised, who I'd walked to school every day until she was old enough to be embarrassed by me, who I'd saved every penny to send to college, even though it meant Margaret and I ate mac and cheese for months. "Mom's right," Derek said, apparently encouraged by my silence. "You're just taking up space now. Dead weight. Dead weight." That's what my family thought of me. I picked up my fork and took another bite of the pot roast I'd made from Margaret's recipe. It tasted like sawdust, but I kept chewing. I kept sitting there, absorbing their words like a sponge soaks up dirty water. "We've already looked into it," Sarah continued, pulling out a brochure from her purse. "Sunset Manor has an opening next week. We can have you moved in by Saturday." Next week. They'd planned this whole thing without asking me. "The house will need to be sold, of course," Derek added, cutting another piece of steak. "Sarah and I will handle all of that. Don't worry about the details." The house. The house where Margaret and I had lived for 38 years, where we'd brought Sarah home as a baby, where we'd celebrated birthdays and anniversaries and quiet Sunday mornings. They were going to sell it like it meant nothing. I nodded slowly, mechanically. What else could I do? Fight them? At 61, recently widowed, with a modest pension and Social Security. What power did I have? "Good," Sarah said, relief flooding her voice. "I'm glad you're being reasonable about this." Reasonable. There was that word again. Tommy suddenly straightened in his chair, his phone screen illuminating his pale face. "Wait," he said, his voice cracking with adolescent uncertainty. "Grandpa? Grandpa Blaine. What is it, honey?" Sarah asked, irritated by the interruption of her victory speech. Tommy's hand was shaking as he held up his phone. "Grandpa Blaine is. He's on the Forbes Billionaire List." The silence that followed was deafening. Derek's fork clattered against his plate. Sarah's mouth fell open like a broken hinge. "What?" Derek snatched the phone from Tommy's hands, his eyes scanning the screen frantically. I watched their faces change. The smug satisfaction melted away, replaced by confusion, then disbelief, then something that looked almost like fear. "Blaine Thompson," Derek read aloud, his voice strangled. "Real estate mogul. Net worth estimated at $8 billion. Sarah grabbed the phone, scrolling desperately. "This can't be right. There has to be some mistake. Dad doesn't have money. He drives that old pickup truck. He shops at Walmart." I took another bite of pot roast. It still tasted like sawdust, but now there was something else mixed in. Something that tasted almost like satisfaction. They stared at me with new eyes. These people who'd just finished explaining how worthless I was. Derek's face had gone pale and Sarah looked like she might be sick. "Dad." Sarah's voice was small now, uncertain. Is this real?" I set down my fork carefully, the same way I'd been setting it down for 40 years at this table. I looked at my daughter, my son-in-law, and my grandson, 3 generations of my family, and only one of them looked happy about the news. "Pass the salt, please," I said quietly. The pot roast suddenly didn't taste like sawdust anymore. The next morning, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise through the same window I'd looked through for 38 years. Margaret's empty chair across from me felt like a physical presence. She should have been here to see their faces last night. She would have laughed until she cried. My phone had been ringing since 6 a.m. Sarah called 17 times before I finally turned it off. Derek tried the landline next, then showed up at my door at 7:30, pounding like the house was on fire. I watched him through the curtains, red-faced and desperate, before he finally gave up and drove away in his BMW. The BMW I'd helped him buy, though he didn't know that. People think building an empire means you have to live like an emperor. They're wrong. The smartest thing I ever did was learn to live like I had nothing while accumulating everything. It started in 1983. I was 25, married to Margaret for 2 years, and we'd just had Sarah. I was working construction then, real construction. Not the made-up job Derek thought I did. My hands were permanently stained with concrete dust, my back ached every morning, and I made $12 an hour. One day, our crew was demolishing an old apartment building downtown. The owner was some out-of-state investor who wanted to build a shopping center. While we worked, I kept thinking about the location, the foot traffic, the potential. That night, I went to the library and researched property values in the area. The investor was selling cheap because he needed quick cash. The building was worth nothing, but the land underneath it was pure gold. I borrowed against everything Margaret and I owned: our car, our wedding rings, even the small savings account we'd started for Sarah's college fund. I bought that lot for $28,000, using a shell company I created with the help of a lawyer I'd met at the library. Margaret thought I'd lost my mind. "Blaine," she said that night, holding 3-month-old Sarah in our tiny kitchen, "we have $47 left in checking. What if this doesn't work?" "Then we'll figure something else out," I told her, but my hands were shaking as I said it. 6 months later, the city announced plans for a new transit line. Property values in the area tripled overnight. I sold that lot for $90,000. That was the beginning. I took that profit and bought 2 more properties, both through different shell companies. Margaret and I kept living in our small apartment, driving our beat-up Honda, shopping at discount stores. When people asked about work, I told them construction was going well. Technically true, since I was constructing a real estate portfolio. By the time Sarah started kindergarten, I owned 12 properties across 3 states. By the time she graduated high school, it was 48 properties and several commercial developments. When she got married 10 years ago, I was worth more than most small countries, and through it all, we lived like we always had. Modest house, reliable cars, sensible clothes. Margaret understood why. She'd grown up poor too, watched her family torn apart by jealousy and greed when her grandfather struck oil on his farm. "Money changes people," she used to say, "but it changes the people around you even more." She was right. We saw it happen to friends who came into money. Suddenly, everyone was their best friend. Everyone had investment opportunities. Everyone needed help with bills. Families split apart over inheritances. Children stopped calling unless they needed something. We decided early on that our money would stay invisible until we were gone. Sarah would inherit everything, but only after we'd lived our lives without the poison of expectation and manipulation. The irony is delicious now. Sarah spent her entire adult life embarrassed by her poor father. She made excuses about our house when her friends came over. She never invited us to fancy parties because we didn't dress right. When Derek came along with his finance degree and his expensive suits, she was so proud to finally have some class in the family. Derek proposed to her at a restaurant that cost more than I made in a month, at least according to what they thought I made. He presented himself as her ticket to the good life, the provider who would give her everything her disappointing father couldn't. If they'd only known that I owned the restaurant where he proposed, along with half the block it sat on. The morning after the rehearsal dinner, Derek pulled me aside. I remember it clearly because Margaret had to hide her smile when she saw us talking. "Blaine," he said, straightening his designer tie, "I want you to know that you don't need to worry about Sarah anymore. I'll take care of her the way she deserves. She won't have to live like this anymore." He gestured around our living room at the furniture we'd bought secondhand and the carpet we'd installed ourselves. His expression was a mixture of pity and disgust. "That's good," I said. "She deserves to be happy." "Exactly." He clapped me on the shoulder like I was a child who'd finally understood a simple concept. "And don't worry about money for the wedding. I know this must be hard on your budget. Sarah and I will handle everything ourselves." They spent $60,000 on that wedding. I know because I owned the venue and catering company they used. I gave them a substantial family discount that Derek attributed to his negotiating skills. For 10 years, I watched Derek treat me like a charity case. He'd slip me $50 at holidays, telling me to get yourself something nice. He'd offer to help fix things around the house, speaking slowly like I might not understand complex concepts like plumbing or electrical work. When Sarah got pregnant with Tommy, Derek made a big show of setting up a college fund, implying that I certainly couldn't contribute anything meaningful to my grandson's future. The college fund he started with such fanfare now holds about $15,000. The fund I started for Tommy the day he was born, hidden in trusts and investment accounts, is worth $2 million and growing. Margaret died without seeing Sarah learn the truth. In her final weeks, she made me promise I'd tell her eventually. "She needs to know," Margaret whispered one night, her voice weak but determined. "Not for the money, Blaine. She needs to know who you really are, what you sacrificed to build this for her." I thought I'd have more time to figure out how to tell her. I thought maybe after some grieving period, after the dust settled from losing Margaret, we could sit down and I could explain everything. I could show her the property deeds, the investment portfolios, the charitable foundations I'd established in her name. Instead, she tried to throw me in a nursing home and told me I had no value. Now, sitting in my kitchen with Margaret's empty chair and my silent phone, I had to decide what to do with the truth she'd finally stumbled across. The doorbell rang. Through the curtains, I could see Sarah's car in the driveway. She was back, probably with 1,000 questions and a completely different attitude. I finished my coffee slowly, in no hurry to answer the door. After all, I was just a worthless old man with no value. What could I possibly have to say that would interest her? Sarah rang the doorbell 14 times before I finally opened it. She stood on my porch in a cream-colored dress I'd never seen before, her hair perfectly styled, makeup carefully applied. She looked like she was dressed for a job interview, which in a way I suppose she was. "Dad," she breathed, her voice trembling with what she probably thought sounded like emotion. "We need to talk." Behind her, Derek sat in their BMW, engine running, phone pressed to his ear. He was probably calling his office, canceling meetings, rearranging his entire day around this conversation he'd never planned to have. I stepped aside to let her in. She walked into the living room like she was seeing it for the first time, her eyes scanning the familiar furniture with new calculation. The couch where she'd watched Saturday morning cartoons was suddenly not just a couch. The bookshelf where Margaret kept her romance novels was now a potential asset to be appraised. "Is it true?" she asked, perching on the edge of the recliner like she might need to run at any moment. I settled into my usual spot on the couch, the same spot I'd occupied for 38 years. "Is what true?" "Dad, please." Her voice cracked, and for a moment she sounded like the little girl who used to crawl into our bed during thunderstorms. "The Forbes thing, the billions. Is it real?" I looked at her carefully. really looked at her. When had she gotten so thin? When had those lines appeared around her eyes? She was 43 years old, and I realized I barely knew the woman she'd become. "Yes," I said simply. The word hung in the air between us like a confession. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth, and she made a sound that might have been a sob or a laugh or both. "How?" she whispered through her fingers. "How is this possible?" Before I could answer, Derek appeared in the doorway, his face flushed from running across the yard. "Blaine, we need to discuss this situation immediately." Situation. Everything was always a situation with Derek. "The phone's been ringing nonstop," he continued, pulling out his cell phone and scrolling through missed calls. "Business Journal wants an interview. Channel 7 News is asking for a statement. There's a reporter from the Washington Post trying to track down your address." I felt a chill run down my spine. This was exactly what Margaret and I had always feared. The circus, the attention, the vultures circling. "How did they find out?" I asked. Derek's face went red. "Tommy posted about it on social media last night. Instagram, TikTok, Twitter. It's everywhere now." Sarah whirled around to face him. "He did what?" "I tried to get him to delete it, but it was too late. Screenshots, shares, the whole thing went viral. My grandpa is secretly a billionaire, or something like that." I closed my eyes, imagining Tommy's excitement, his pride in sharing this incredible discovery about his grandpa. He couldn't have known what he was unleashing. "We need damage control," Derek said, pacing now, his lawyer instincts kicking in. "Media management, security, financial advisors. This is going to be a nightmare if we don't get ahead of it." Suddenly everything was we. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes intense. "Dad, where is it? The money, I mean. How do we access it?" The question I'd been dreading. Not, "Are you okay?" Or, "Why didn't you tell us?" Just straight to the money. "It's complicated," I said. "Complicated how?" Derek stopped pacing and fixed me with his courtroom stare. "Are we talking about liquid assets, real estate portfolios, investment accounts? I need specifics, Blaine." The doorbell rang again, followed immediately by aggressive knocking. Through the window I could see a woman in a red suit holding a microphone, followed by a man with a camera. "Shit," Derek muttered, moving toward the window. They found the house. More cars were pulling up outside. News vans, reporters, neighbors coming out of their houses to see what was happening. Mrs. Patterson from next door was pointing at my house and talking animatedly to a young man with a notebook. My quiet street, the place where Margaret and I had lived in peaceful anonymity for 4 decades, was turning into a carnival. "We can't stay here," Sarah said, standing up and peering through the curtains. "Dad, do you have somewhere else we can go? Somewhere private where we can figure this out?" I almost laughed. Did I have somewhere else? I had 17 somewhere elses, including a penthouse in Manhattan that Derek had probably walked past 1,000 times without knowing his father-in-law owned the entire building. But looking at their faces, seeing the panic and calculation in their eyes, I realized something important. They weren't worried about me. They weren't concerned about my privacy or my safety or my well-being. They were worried about their access to whatever I had. "I need some air," I said, standing up. "Dad, you can't go outside," Sarah protested. "There are reporters everywhere. Then I'll go out the back." I walked through the kitchen to the back door, stepping onto the small patio where Margaret used to tend her tomato plants. The garden was overgrown now, weeds choking out the flowers she'd planted last spring. I'd been meaning to clean it up, but every time I looked at it, I missed her so much I couldn't breathe. Sarah and Derek followed me outside, their expensive shoes clicking on the concrete steps. "Dad," Sarah said, her voice taking on that wheedling tone she'd perfected as a teenager. "I know last night was difficult. We said some things we didn't mean." Some things we didn't mean. That's what she called telling me I had no value, that I was dead weight, that I should be shipped off to bingo night at Sunset Manor. "Derek was just trying to be practical," she continued. "We thought you were struggling financially. We were trying to help." Help. They were trying to help by selling my house and putting me in a home so they wouldn't have to deal with me anymore. "If we'd known about your resources, we would have approached things differently," Derek added, loosening his tie in the afternoon heat. Resources? Is that what they were calling it now? "The thing is," Sarah said, moving closer, "we need to make some decisions quickly. The media attention, the security risks, the tax implications. This is a lot to handle alone, Dad. You need help managing all of this." There it was, the pitch. The reason for the pretty dress and the fake concern and the sudden interest in my well-being. They wanted to manage my money. I've been managing just fine for 40 years, I said quietly. But Dad, Sarah's voice was getting higher, more desperate. This is different now. Everyone knows. There will be people trying to take advantage of you. Scam artists, gold diggers. You need protection. The irony was so thick I could taste it. She was warning me about gold diggers while positioning herself to dig for gold. A knock at the back gate interrupted us. A young reporter had found his way into the alley, notebook in hand, camera around his neck. Mr. Thompson, I'm Jake Morrison from Channel 12 News. Could I ask you a few questions about your business empire? Derek immediately went into lawyer mode, stepping between me and the reporter. Mr. Thompson has no comment at this time. This is private property and you're trespassing. Just a quick question about how you managed to build such wealth while maintaining such a modest lifestyle. The reporter's question hit closer to home than I expected. That had been the whole point, hadn't it? To live modestly while building something bigger. To stay invisible until it was time to reveal the truth. But I'd never planned for the truth to come out like this. I'd never planned for Tommy to accidentally expose everything on social media. I'd never planned for Margaret to die before I could figure out how to tell Sarah who I really was. And I'd certainly never planned for my daughter to try to throw me away like garbage the night before the world found out I was worth nearly $3 billion. No comment, I said to the reporter, then turned and walked back into the house. Sarah and Derek hurried after me, their footsteps urgent on the kitchen tile. Dad, we really need to discuss this, Sarah said as I headed toward the stairs. I paused on the bottom step, my hand on the banister Margaret had polished every week for 38 years. Tomorrow, I said. We'll talk tomorrow. But Dad, tomorrow, Sarah. I climbed the stairs to the bedroom I'd shared with Margaret, closing the door behind me. Outside, I could hear more cars arriving, more voices, more chaos descending on the quiet life we'd built together. From the window, I watched Sarah and Derek standing in the front yard, surrounded by reporters, trying to control a story that had already spiraled far beyond their reach. Derek was gesturing animatedly, probably claiming to be my spokesperson or advisor. Sarah was smiling for the cameras, her hand shielding her eyes from the afternoon sun, playing the role of the devoted daughter who'd always known her father was special. I wondered what they'd told the reporters about last night's dinner. I wondered if they'd mentioned Sunset Manor or bingo nights or how worthless they thought I was just 12 hours ago. Probably not. Tomorrow I'd have to decide what to do about all of this. But tonight, I just wanted to sit in the bedroom I'd shared with Margaret and remember what it felt like when the only person who knew my secrets was the only person who mattered. I woke up at 5:30, the same time I'd been waking up for 40 years. Margaret used to say my internal clock was more reliable than Big Ben. The house was quiet, but outside I could see the news vans still parked along my street like sleeping predators. By 6 a.m. I was dressed and sitting in my kitchen with coffee and the newspaper. The newspaper I'd been reading at this same table for 38 years, except today my face was on the front page above the headline, "Mystery Billionaire Lived Next Door." The article was surprisingly accurate, considering they'd had less than 24 hours to research my life. They'd found records of some of my property holdings, interviewed former construction workers who remembered me, even tracked down my old boss from the 1980s. Blaine was always asking questions, the article quoted him saying, smart questions about property values, zoning laws, development plans. I thought he was just curious. Turns out he was planning. Planning. That was one way to put it. My phone started ringing at 6:15. Sarah again. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to her message while I made breakfast. Dad, it's me. Derek talked to some people last night, financial advisors and lawyers, and they all agree you need professional help managing this situation. We've set up a meeting at Derek's office this morning at 10. Don't talk to any reporters until then, okay? We need to get our story straight. Our story. Get our story straight. I deleted the message and made myself eggs and toast. Margaret's recipe for both, though mine never tasted quite the same as hers. At 8 o'clock, a black sedan pulled up outside. I watched through the kitchen window as a man in an expensive suit got out, briefcase in hand. He walked straight to my front door like he owned the place. The knock was confident, authoritative. Through the peephole, I could see he was about 50, silver hair, the kind of practiced smile that probably cost him $50,000 a year in dental work. Mr. Thompson, my name is Richard Blackstone. I'm a wealth management specialist. I think we need to talk. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. About what? About protecting your assets, sir. About security. About making sure your family is taken care of properly. His smile widened. May I come in? No. The smile faltered just slightly. Mr. Thompson, I understand this must be overwhelming. Sudden wealth can be very challenging to navigate. I've helped many clients in similar situations. Similar to what? Well, to your situation. Newly public wealth, family considerations, tax implications. Mr. Blackstone, I said, leaning against the doorframe, exactly how do you think I accumulated nearly $3 billion without understanding tax implications? His practiced charm cracked a little more. Behind him, I could see reporters taking pictures of our conversation. Of course, sir. I just meant that managing public wealth is different from private wealth. There are new considerations now, such as security, for one thing, privacy protection, family dynamics. He lowered his voice conspiratorially. I understand there may be some tension with your daughter and son-in-law about how your assets should be managed. I looked at him for a long moment. Who sent you, Mr. Blackstone? I'm sorry, Derek or Sarah? Which one hired you to come here and convince me I need help? His face went red. Sir, I can assure you that I'm here independently seeking to... I closed the door in his face. 10 minutes later, Derek's BMW pulled up behind the black sedan. Derek got out, his face already flushed with anger as he approached Blackstone. I couldn't hear their conversation, but their body language was clear enough. Derek was furious that his hired gun had failed so spectacularly. Sarah emerged from the passenger seat wearing another outfit I'd never seen. This one navy blue and probably worth more than most people's monthly rent. She looked around at the reporters and cameras with the expression of someone who just realized she was in over her head. The doorbell rang again. This time I ignored it. It rang 17 more times over the next hour, followed by increasingly frantic knocking and Sarah calling my name through the door. Finally, I heard Derek's voice, calm and measured in his lawyer tone. Blaine, we know you're in there. We can see you moving around. We're not leaving until we talk. I opened the door and looked at both of them standing on my porch like door-to-door salesmen. You sent that man here, I said to Derek. What man? He tried to look confused, but Derek had always been a terrible liar. Richard Blackstone, wealth management specialist. Did you really think I'd fall for that? Sarah stepped forward. Dad, we're just trying to help. This is all happening so fast, and there are people who will try to take advantage of you. People like you. The words came out harsher than I'd intended, but I didn't take them back. Sarah flinched like I'd slapped her. That's not fair, she said, her voice small. We're your family. Family. I tasted the word like it was poison. Is that what you called me last night when you said I had no value? When you wanted to ship me off to bingo nights at Sunset Manor? Derek cleared his throat. Blaine, emotions were running high last night. We all said things we regret, but we need to focus on moving forward now. Moving forward with what? With managing your wealth responsibly, with protecting your legacy, with making sure your assets are properly structured for tax efficiency and estate planning. I almost laughed. Estate planning. 3 days ago they were planning to put me in a nursing home, and now they were worried about my estate planning. I have a lawyer, I said. You do? Sarah looked surprised. Who? Someone who's been handling my affairs for 30 years. Someone who knows about all of this already. That wasn't entirely true. I had several lawyers, actually, representing different aspects of my business interests through various shell companies and trusts. But they didn't need to know that yet. Derek's face was getting redder. Blaine, with all due respect, whoever you've been using for basic legal work isn't equipped to handle wealth at this level. You need specialists, tax attorneys, estate planners, wealth managers. I need a shower, I said, and started to close the door. Sarah stuck her foot in the doorway. Dad, please. Just listen to us for 5 minutes. I looked down at her expensive shoe blocking my door, then back up at her face. She was trying to look desperate and loving, but there was something else in her eyes, something calculating. 5 minutes, I said, stepping back. They followed me into the living room, both of them sitting on the edge of the couch like they were ready to spring into action at any moment. Okay, Derek said, pulling out his phone and opening what looked like a notes app. First priority is security. You can't stay in this house anymore. Too exposed, too many reporters, too many people who now know where you live. Where would I go? We found a nice hotel downtown, Sarah said quickly. Very secure, very private. We could all stay there while we figure out next steps. All of us, of course. Second, Derek continued, we need to get control of your assets. Move them into properly structured trusts. Make sure everything is legally protected. I've already spoken to several wealth management firms. Without asking me. We're trying to be proactive, Blaine. Time is critical here. Critical for what? Derek and Sarah exchanged a look I didn't like. Dad? Sarah said, her voice taking on that patronizing tone she used with Tommy when he was being difficult. You're 61 years old. You've just suffered a major loss with Mom's death. You're probably not thinking as clearly as you normally would. What are you saying? I'm saying that maybe you shouldn't be making major financial decisions right now. Maybe you need help. There it was, the real pitch. They weren't just trying to manage my money. They were trying to prove I wasn't capable of managing it myself. I stood up slowly, my joints creaking in protest. Derek and Sarah watched me like they were afraid I might fall over. Get out, I said quietly. Dad, get out of my house. Blaine, be reasonable. I walked to the front door and opened it wide. The reporters outside immediately started shouting questions and taking pictures. You have 10 seconds to leave before I tell these nice reporters exactly what you said to me last night at dinner. Sarah went pale. Derek's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. You wouldn't, Sarah whispered. Try me. They left, but not quietly. Derek was muttering about legal action and cognitive evaluations as they walked to their car. Sarah was crying, or at least pretending to cry, probably for the benefit of the cameras. I closed the door and went back to my kitchen, where my coffee was getting cold and the newspaper was still open to my photograph. In the picture, I looked like exactly what I was. A tired old man in a flannel shirt who just wanted to be left alone. But I wasn't going to be left alone. Not now. Not after Tommy's social media post had opened Pandora's box. The secret I'd kept for 40 years was out, and everyone I'd ever known was going to want their piece of it. Sarah and Derek would be back, probably with lawyers and doctors and court orders. Other relatives would start crawling out of the woodwork. Strangers would show up at my door with investment opportunities and sob stories and marriage proposals. Margaret had been right. Money didn't change you. It changed everyone around you. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. James Morrison, the lawyer who'd helped me set up my first shell company in 1983. He was probably 75 now, maybe retired, but if anyone would understand the mess I was in, it was him. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. James Morrison. Jim, it's Blaine Thompson. A pause. Well, I'll be damned. I saw you on the news this morning. Wondered when you'd call. I need help, Jim. I figured you might. Want to tell me what's going on? I looked around my kitchen, at Margaret's empty chair and the newspaper with my face on it, and the cold coffee that tasted like 40 years of careful planning falling apart. My family wants to have me declared incompetent so they can control my money. The same family that didn't know you had any money until yesterday? That's the one. Jim chuckled, a dry sound that reminded me why I'd trusted him for 3 decades. Well, Blaine, sounds like it's time to stop playing defense. Jim Morrison arrived at my house 3 hours later, driving the same beat-up Honda Civic he'd owned since the Clinton administration. He was thinner than I remembered, his hair completely white now, but his handshake was still firm and his eyes were still sharp as a hawk's. You look like hell, Blaine, he said, settling into Margaret's chair at the kitchen table without being asked. Jim had always been comfortable in my house, one of the few people who knew the real story from the beginning. I feel like it. He pulled out a worn leather briefcase and extracted a thick folder. I've been following your empire for 30 years, remember? I know exactly what you're worth, what you own, and how it's all structured. The question is, what do you want to do about your family? I poured him coffee and sat down across from him. Outside, I could see reporters still camped on my street, but they'd stopped bothering to ring the doorbell. They want me declared incompetent, I said. That's what you told me on the phone. Any basis for it? I'm 61 and recently widowed. They think that makes me vulnerable. Jim snorted. You've been making billion-dollar decisions for decades. Any judge who declares you incompetent needs their own competency hearing. He opened the folder and spread out papers across the table. But here's what worries me. They don't need to prove you're incompetent forever. They just need to prove you're temporarily incapacitated. Grief, depression, poor judgment following a spouse's death. They could get temporary conservatorship, and temporary has a way of becoming permanent. My stomach clenched. Can they do that? With the right lawyer and the right judge? Maybe. Especially if they can show you're making erratic decisions or being influenced by outside parties. What kind of erratic decisions? Giving away money, making sudden changes to your will, cutting family members out of inheritances. He looked at me carefully. Were you planning to do any of those things? I thought about Sarah's face when she told me I had no value, Derek's smugness when he explained I was dead weight, the way they'd already picked out my nursing home and planned to sell my house. Yes, I said. Jim nodded like he'd expected that answer. Then we need to be very careful about how we do this. If you make dramatic changes to your estate right now, while emotions are high and the media is watching, it could look exactly like what they'll claim. An old man making poor decisions because he's not thinking clearly. So what do you suggest? We get ahead of it. We make your decisions look rational, well-planned, and legally bulletproof. He pulled out a legal pad and uncapped a pen. Tell me exactly what happened at that dinner. I told him everything. Sarah's coldness, Derek's calculations, the way they'd discussed my future like I wasn't sitting right there. The nursing home brochure, the plans to sell the house, the casual cruelty of being told I had no value anymore. Jim took notes, his expression getting darker with each detail. They recorded any of this? He asked. I don't think so. Pity. Would have made things easier. He tapped his pen against the pad. But we can work with this. Here's what we're going to do. Over the next 2 hours, Jim laid out a strategy that was both elegant and ruthless. We would restructure my entire estate, but we'd do it in a way that looked thoughtful and deliberate rather than reactive. First, we'd establish a detailed timeline showing that I'd been planning changes to my will since before Margaret's death, based on conversations she and I had about wanting to ensure Tommy's future while making sure Sarah learned the value of work. Margaret kept journals, I told Jim. She wrote about our conversations about the money, about wanting Sarah to understand what real work meant. Perfect. That establishes premeditation and sound reasoning. Second, we'd create a comprehensive psychological evaluation showing I was mentally competent and making rational decisions. Jim knew a respected psychiatrist who specialized in capacity evaluations. Dr. Sarah Chen. She's testified in hundreds of cases. If she says you're competent, no judge in the state will question it. Third, we'd document every interaction I'd had with Sarah and Derek since Margaret's death, particularly their attempts to control my assets and their hiring of Richard Blackstone without my consent. That shows a pattern of manipulation and overreach, Jim explained. It supports your decision to limit their access. But the most important part of the plan was the restructuring itself. I'm going to create a trust for Tommy, I told Jim. Full funding for education, health care, housing until he's 30. After that, he gets the principal if he's earned it. Earned it how? College degree, 2 years of meaningful work, no criminal record. And he has to spend 1 year working with a charitable organization that helps families in crisis. Jim smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. I like that. Shows you're thinking about character development, not just money management. For Sarah, I would create a smaller trust that would provide a comfortable living if she needed it, but wouldn't fund the entitled lifestyle she'd become accustomed to. How much? Jim asked. Enough for a nice house, a reliable car, and security. Not enough for country club memberships and designer clothes. And Derek? I met Jim's eyes. Derek gets exactly what he thought I was worth when he married my daughter. Nothing. The bulk of my estate would go to a foundation Margaret and I had discussed creating, focused on helping families transition out of abusive situations. It would be named after Margaret, and Tommy would have the option to join the board when he turned 25. This is good, Jim said, reviewing the structure we'd outlined. It shows long-term thinking, moral reasoning, and genuine care for family while holding them accountable. No judge would call this the work of an incompetent mind. We spent another hour working out details, then Jim packed up his papers. I'll have the documents drawn up by tomorrow, he said. We'll execute everything properly, with witnesses and video recording showing you're lucid and deliberate. Once it's done, it'll be very hard for anyone to challenge. After Jim left, I sat alone in my kitchen as the sun set outside my window. The reporters were still there, but they'd settled in for the long haul, some of them eating takeout food while they waited for something interesting to happen. My phone had been buzzing all afternoon with calls from numbers I didn't recognize. Sarah had called 6 more times, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails. Derek had sent a series of text messages that started apologetic and got progressively more threatening. At 8 o'clock, headlights swept across my living room window. A car door slammed, followed by the sound of someone running up my front walk. The knock was frantic, urgent. Through the peephole, I could see Tommy standing on my porch, his young face streaked with tears. I opened the door immediately. "Grandpa," he said, throwing his arms around me. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know this would happen. I didn't mean to mess everything up." I held him tight, this 16-year-old boy who still called me Grandpa instead of calculating my net worth. "You didn't mess anything up, Tommy." "But I did. I posted about it online, and now there's all these people, and Mom and Derek are fighting, and everyone's mad at each other." I guided him inside, away from the cameras and reporters who were undoubtedly photographing this reunion. "Where are your parents?" "At Derek's office. They've been there all day with lawyers and financial people, talking about what to do about you." He wiped his nose with his sleeve. "They think you're going crazy because of Grandma Margaret dying. What do you think?" Tommy looked at me with Margaret's eyes, studying my face carefully. "I think you're sad, but not crazy. And I think Mom and Derek are being really mean to you. This boy, this wonderful, honest boy who saw things exactly as they were." "Tommy," I said, sitting down next to him on the couch, "there are going to be some changes coming. Things between me and your parents might get complicated. Are you going to cut them off? Like, completely?" The question surprised me with its directness, but Tommy had always been perceptive. "I'm going to make sure you're taken care of," I said. "Your future, your education, your security. That's the most important thing to me." "But what about Mom?" I thought about how to answer that. How do you tell a 16-year-old that his mother had revealed herself to be someone I barely recognized? That she'd been so quick to discard me when she thought I was worthless, and so desperate to control me now that she knew I wasn't? "Your mom is going to have to figure out what kind of person she wants to be," I said finally. "And what kind of relationship she wants with me." Tommy nodded solemnly, understanding more than I'd given him credit for. "Grandpa, can I ask you something?" "Anything. Why didn't you tell us? About the money, I mean. Why did you let everyone think you were just regular?" I smiled, remembering Margaret asking me the same question years ago, and my answer then was the same as my answer now. "Because I wanted to know who you all really were, when you thought I had nothing to offer except love." Tommy was quiet for a long moment, processing that. "And now you know," he said. "Now I know." He leaned against me, this tall, gangly teenager who was still young enough to need his grandfather's comfort. "I love you, Grandpa. Not because of the money. Just because you're you." I held him close, feeling something settle in my chest that had been twisted and painful since Margaret's funeral. Some bonds couldn't be bought, couldn't be calculated, couldn't be destroyed by greed or manipulation. "I love you too, Tommy, and I always will." Outside, the reporters continued their vigil, waiting for the next chapter of a story they didn't really understand. They thought this was about money, about a hidden fortune and family drama. But it wasn't about money. It had never been about money. It was about finding out who really loved you when they thought you had nothing left to give. 3 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my new home, watching the sun rise over the lake through floor-to-ceiling windows. The house was smaller than what I could have afforded, but it was perfect for what I needed. Privacy, security, and enough space for Tommy to visit whenever he wanted. The reporters had given up after the first month, once they realized there would be no dramatic court battles or family feuds to document. The legal documents Jim had prepared were ironclad, and Dr. Chen's psychological evaluation had been so thorough and positive that Derek's lawyers had quietly advised him to drop any thoughts of challenging my competency. Sarah had tried to contest the will anyway. She'd hired 3 different law firms, each one telling her the same thing. The trust structure was legally sound, the reasoning was well documented, and any judge would see her challenge as exactly what it was, a greedy daughter angry that her free ride was over. The last time I spoke to her was 6 weeks ago when she showed up at my old house to find it empty. I'd sold it the day after the new will was executed, donating the proceeds to Margaret's foundation. Sarah had called me, screaming about sentimental value and family history and how I was destroying her childhood. "You destroyed your own childhood the night you told me I had no value," I'd said, and hung up. I hadn't heard from her since. Derek had filed for divorce 2 weeks after that, once he realized Sarah wouldn't be inheriting billions after all. The divorce proceedings were ugly and public, with Derek claiming Sarah had misrepresented her family's financial situation. Sarah was fighting for alimony, but Derek's prenup was apparently as thorough as his earlier attempts to control my money. I felt no satisfaction in their misery, just emptiness where love for my daughter used to live. But Tommy was a different story. The sound of a car in my driveway interrupted my morning coffee ritual. Through the window, I could see Tommy climbing out of his beat-up Honda, the car I'd bought him for his 17th birthday, along with driving lessons from a professional instructor. Nothing flashy, nothing that would make him a target, but reliable and safe. He came through the back door without knocking, the way Margaret used to do when she'd come back from the grocery store. "Morning, Grandpa," he said, grabbing a mug from the cabinet and pouring himself coffee like he lived there. Which in many ways he did. After his parents' divorce turned nasty, Tommy had asked the court to let him live with me. The judge had been hesitant at first. A 17-year-old living with his billionaire grandfather raised obvious concerns about undue influence. But when Tommy explained calmly and clearly that he simply felt safer and more loved in my house than in either of his parents' homes, the judge had agreed to a trial period. That trial period had become permanent when Sarah missed 3 consecutive custody visits and Derek moved to another state to take a job with a law firm that didn't know about his failed attempt to marry into money. "You're up early," I said, watching Tommy doctor his coffee with the same amount of cream and sugar Margaret used to use. Couldn't sleep, too excited about today. Today? I'd almost forgotten. At 17, Tommy was graduating high school a year early, having thrown himself into his studies with the kind of focus I recognized from my own youth. The kind of focus that comes from wanting to prove you're worth more than what people expect. "You sure you want me there?" I asked. "It'll probably attract attention." Tommy rolled his eyes. "Grandpa, I don't care if the president shows up with a marching band. You're my family. You belong there." Family. The word meant something different now than it had 6 months ago. We drove to the graduation ceremony together in my modest Toyota, the same car I'd been driving for 5 years, much to the disappointment of reporters who'd expected a billionaire to upgrade his lifestyle overnight. Tommy wore the suit we'd bought together last week, navy blue and well-fitted, but not expensive enough to make his classmates uncomfortable. The ceremony was held in the high school gymnasium, the same place where I'd watched Sarah graduate 25 years earlier. She'd been valedictorian then, brilliant and driven and full of potential. I'd been so proud, sitting in these same bleachers next to Margaret, believing my daughter would conquer the world. Now my grandson was graduating in the top 10% of his class, heading to State University in the fall on partial academic scholarship. I'd offered to pay his full tuition, but Tommy had insisted on earning as much as he could himself. "I want to know I deserve it," he'd told me, sounding so much like Margaret it made my chest ache. When they called his name, Tommy walked across the stage with quiet confidence, accepting his diploma with a smile that was genuinely happy rather than triumphant. In the audience, I clapped harder than I'd clapped for anything in years. After the ceremony, we went to dinner at the same restaurant where Margaret and I used to celebrate special occasions. Nothing fancy, just good food and comfortable booths and waitresses who'd known us for decades. "So," Tommy said, cutting into his steak, "have you decided what you're going to do with the rest of your life?" The question caught me off guard. At 62, I'd been assuming the rest of my life would be relatively quiet, managing my investments, overseeing Margaret's foundation, enjoying my grandson's visits. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you're rich enough to do anything, go anywhere. You could travel the world, buy a baseball team, start a space program." He grinned. "You could run for president." I laughed, imagining the campaign ads. "Vote for Blaine Thompson. He lived in the same house for 40 years and drove a pickup truck." "That might actually work," Tommy said seriously. "People would probably find it refreshing." We talked through dessert about his plans for college, his interest in studying business and maybe law, his idea about joining the Peace Corps after graduation. He had Margaret's idealism combined with my practicality, a combination that would serve him well in whatever life he chose. As we drove home, Tommy was quiet, staring out the window at the familiar streets of the town where we'd both grown up. "Grandpa," he said finally. "Yeah? Do you ever miss her? Mom, I mean, the way she used to be?" I thought about that question carefully. Did I miss Sarah? The real Sarah, the little girl who used to crawl into bed with Margaret and me during thunderstorms, who used to help me with yard work on Saturday mornings, who used to tell me about her day at school while we made dinner together. "Every day," I said honestly. "But the woman she became, I don't think I ever really knew that person." Tommy nodded. I keep hoping she'll figure it out, that she'll realize what she lost and try to fix it. Maybe she will someday. Would you forgive her? If she did? I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment with the engine running, thinking about forgiveness and second chances, and whether some wounds ever really heal. I'd listen, I said finally. But forgiveness, that would depend on whether she was sorry for what she did, or just sorry she got caught. That weekend, Tommy helped me plant a garden behind the house. Margaret had always wanted to try growing vegetables, but we'd never had the right soil conditions at the old place. This house came with raised beds that the previous owner had built but never used. We planted tomatoes and peppers and herbs, working side by side in the afternoon sun. Tommy had inherited Margaret's green thumb along with her eyes, and he seemed to know instinctively how deep to plant each seedling, how much water each one needed. "Grandma would have loved this," he said, wiping dirt from his hands on his jeans. "She would have," I agreed. "She would have loved seeing you grow up into the man you're becoming too." Tommy was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'm glad she never had to see what happened with Mom and Derek. It would have broken her heart." He was right. Margaret had always believed the best in people, especially family. She would have found some way to excuse Sarah's behavior, to rationalize Derek's greed, to maintain hope that love would eventually win out over selfishness. Maybe it was better that she'd gone to her grave still believing her daughter was basically good, just temporarily lost. That evening I sat on my back porch watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and red. Tommy was inside doing homework, classical music drifting through the open windows. The scene was so peaceful, so perfectly ordinary, that I almost couldn't believe this was my life now. My phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment my heart jumped, thinking it might be Sarah reaching out, but it was from Jim Morrison. "Foundation paperwork is complete. Margaret's Memorial Fund officially launches next month. Board meeting scheduled for the 15th. You should be proud, Blaine. You built something that will help people long after we're all gone." I typed back, "Margaret built it. I just funded it." His response came quickly. "You both built it, and Tommy will carry it forward." Tommy. My grandson, my heir, my second chance at raising someone who understood that wealth meant responsibility, not entitlement. In a few months, he'd be away at college, starting his own journey, making his own mistakes and discoveries. But for now, he was here, filling the house with music and laughter and the kind of easy conversation I'd shared with Margaret for 43 years. For now, I had exactly what I'd always wanted. A family member who loved me for who I was, not what I could give them. The reporters had been right about one thing. Money had changed my life, but not in the way they'd expected. It hadn't made me powerful or important or glamorous. It had simply revealed who was worth keeping and who wasn't. And in the end, that was worth more than all the billions in my accounts. I finished my coffee as the stars began to appear over the lake, thinking about Margaret and the life we'd built together, about the grandson who carried her spirit forward, and about the strange peace that comes from finally knowing who your real family is. Some people spend their whole lives searching for that kind of certainty. I'd found it at 62, sitting on a porch I actually owned, watching my grandson study for a future he'd earned himself. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.